Welcome to AINdebrief, where we take a look back at the most important aviation stories of the past week by the AIN editors who covered them. I'm AINalerts editor Chad Trautvetter. In this week's episode, air transport editor Gregory Polek discusses Embraer's financial situation and potential commercial airplane partnerships in China or India, as well as rising airline traffic and the reopening of flights at United Arab carriers Etihad and Emirates. London-based editor Charles Alcock gives an overview of new quarantine rules in the UK and layoffs at EasyJet and British Airways. I'll highlight Flexjet CEO Mike Silvestro's bullish outlook on business aviation. Washington, D.C.-based editor Kerry Lynch says ADS-B installations are still continuing past the FAA deadline. And FBO editor Curt Epstein shares some good news on several FBO openings and expansions this week. So the week started off with Embraer's first quarter results, Greg. What did they say about the situation there? And also they talked about some partnerships that they might do with the commercial side.
Yeah, there's been a lot of speculation about what Embraer might do following the collapse of the Boeing deal in April. And one of those things had to do with whether or not it would seek new partners. During the call, Francisco Neto, the CEO, really confirmed that the company is interested in partnerships with other manufacturers, particularly for the commercial division. It wouldn't be as big as the Boeing tie-up, but he did name China and India as possible partners. So I guess that would mean Comac and Hindustan. He also said that the company is looking for capital injections, both private and public, meaning the public part would be from the Brazilian export bank, BNDES. And in terms of the balance sheet, the CFO, Antonio Garcia, was pretty upbeat about it. It says it remains strong despite a really tough first quarter. And that's when it only delivered 5 airplanes because of COVID and the carve out of the commercial division to prepare for the Boeing sale.
Well, and that's 5 commercial airplanes, right?
Yeah, 5 commercial airplanes, right.
What do they expect for the second quarter? Do they talk about, what's coming up?
No, they really don't want to make any projections. They haven't even given a forecast for the end of the year because who knows what's going to happen with COVID. But they're not giving any projections on the number of airplanes they're expecting to produce this year.
And it doesn't sound like they're going to reintegrate the commercial side, right? It sounds like they're going to keep it separate.
No, that's not necessarily true. They still may. And that's one of the things they're talking about. Apparently, there's Neto actually did say that they're working on some sort of a strategic plan to get something together in the next couple of months to come up with some specific plan for whether or not they're going to reverse the carve out of the commercial business or go ahead and have it perhaps stand as a standalone company, or it's very up in the air still.
Okay, let's switch over to the overall industry. We're starting to see some activity rise, and also the Middle East carriers are starting to put more routes in, right?
Yeah, IATA just reported some statistics that showed a 30% increase in flights from a low point, granted, on April 21st to May 27th. Now, again, granted, that's from a very low baseline, so it really doesn't amount to a lot of flights in raw numbers, but it appears to mark a low point and indicate some sort of uptick. Of course, they did say as well that all bets are off basically if the COVID situation spikes again in the fall. So as things stand right now, things are looking up a little bit. As far as the Middle East carriers, just recently the UAE lifted its ban on passenger flights into and out of Abu Dhabi and Dubai. But just for Etihad and Emirates, there's still no foreign carriers can fly there, and there's still a ban on foreigners entering the country. But again, that's another a positive sign that may bring some optimism.
So does that allow passengers to transit at least through Dubai or?
Yeah, exactly. You can fly through there from, for example, somewhere in Europe to Asia through Dubai. So they're allowing for that now. Again, you can't actually just go to Dubai, but you can use it as a transit stop.
Okay, well, that's really good news, actually.
Sure.
So, Charlie, the UK has taken kind of an opposite stance. They put a quarantine in place, and it's not really that great for aviation, right?
It's terrible for aviation, Chad. And just yesterday in the British Parliament, I heard one of the most fractious and negative sort of debates over what this means to aviation that I've heard for a very long time. The government basically has been accused of starting its COVID measures too late. And now it's almost like it's trying to catch up. And the quarantine that it's planning to start from this coming Monday, June the 8th, is almost like its catch-up move, I suppose you could say. And despite staunch opposition from the entire aviation industry, and even from some of its own conservative members of parliament, it's pressing ahead with this. It's saying, we're going ahead with it, and we're not going to change it. And what this means is that anybody traveling to the UK, whether it's in a private jet or an airliner, from Monday will have to fill out a form before they depart, committing to stay at a fixed address for 14 days. And many in aviation say this is really just going to pretty much kill most travel, because who's going to want to put up with that?
They said that there are scientific reasons behind this, but they won't publish it, right?
Yes, that's right. And that's what's making it harder for people to accept. They say that this is necessary to stop, a flare-up of reinfections. But the truth is that most countries in the world, apart from the US, Brazil, and Russia, actually now have lower rates of infection, significantly lower rates of infection than the UK. So, the immortal phrase, shutting the barn door after the horse is bolted, is being bandied around. And yes, they won't even publish the science. And in fact, just today, one of the chief scientists supporting the UK government, when he was questioned in a press conference, he wouldn't even speak up really in favor of the quarantine. So this is adding to the resentment that's being felt. Now, one thing that's of great significance for business aviation in particular, and I just spoke to Mark Bailey, who's the head of the British Business and General Aviation Association, is that they're saying, look, please, can't business aviation, which is very different from air transport, go for what they're calling an alternative means of compliance? They're saying that business aviation could rapidly introduce COVID antibody testing, because it's got much smaller numbers of passengers. They're saying that they could create what they call sanitary travel capsules, which is a fancy word for social distancing. And based on that, they've asked for a general exemption for business aviation from the quarantine. But just this afternoon, Mark Bailey confirmed that just isn't going to happen, at least for the first phase of the quarantine. The quarantine will be reviewed after 3 weeks. Some people are saying the government maybe then will back away from it in order to save face. But it really, really does not look good. There's just no dodging that. And in fact, BBGA is warning that, if this carries on for 3, 4, 5 more months, there are going to be serious casualties in the industry. There are going to be people who just don't survive this. Companies, I mean.
Right. And there's more controversy in the UK. EasyJet and BA, British Airways, announced layoffs this week, and that flies in the face of the assistance they got, right?
Yes, it does. And this really added to the sort of general air of bad feeling in the parliamentary discussion. So, yes, a lot of airlines, including British Airways and EasyJet, took taxpayer money for a pretty generous government scheme to support most of the pay for furloughed workers. And yet now, before the furlough program is even over, it's due to be sort of wound down from July and August. They're saying, no, that isn't enough. We're going to press ahead with thousands of layoffs because, our whole industry is imploding. And so many members of parliament and trade unions and people in the industry are saying, what? Hold on a minute. You can't do that. You can't take the public money and then you're sort of cynically getting rid of jobs anyway. And in some cases, the airlines, BA and EasyJet specifically, appear to be trying to almost take this as an opportunity to renegotiate contracts. So that's caused a lot of bad feeling. And in Parliament, the aviation minister was pressed very hard on this. And you could tell she was squirming. She couldn't justify this. But the bottom line is she said, you know what, there's pretty much nothing we can do. I don't agree with it, but there's nothing that the government can do. And so what this looks like is the government saying, well, it's a free market. We can't stand in the way of airlines doing making these decisions. But at the same time, its actions over the quarantine are kind of interrupting that free market. And that's why people in the industry are saying, no, there needs to be a much broader level of industry support for aviation.
And I imagine the quarantine doesn't help either British Airways or EasyJet as well. I mean, that's probably why they need to reduce people now.
Absolutely. There's no denying that it doesn't help any airlines, and the airline sector is really going to suffer. But I think it's fair to say BA and EasyJet haven't helped engender public sympathy by their actions.
All right. Thanks, Charlie.
You're welcome, Chad. So you, of course, have been looking more closely at business aviation and more specifically at one of the biggest providers of private lift, the charter group Flexjet. Tell us what they've been telling you about how they're getting through this crisis.
Well, Mike Silvestro, the CEO of Flexjet, which is a fractional operation, he was on a Jefferies webinar this week, and he was just talking about what they've done during the pandemic. And they've actually scaled back their fleet to 60 airplanes during a pandemic, but they also stood up something called Project Lift, which is a way to have travel for their crews while the airlines can't do it, to get them to the airplane so that they can complete flights for customers.
Right, that's interesting. So they have managed to keep going, but at the same time, I mean, we all would have been at the eBiz show last week, and I gather that Flexjet had planned some news, but it's had to defer that. Is that right?
That's correct. Actually, what Mike said was that had eBase gone on as planned last week, they would have announced a European expansion. They have Flexjet Europe. They stood that up about 3 or 4 years ago. They have about a dozen airplanes, I think, over there. They're mostly smaller on the lighter end. I imagine that they want to increase that with larger aircraft, midsize and large cabin, but they didn't really talk about that. And they just said that they've deferred plans until spring next year, probably about eBase 2021.
Interesting. But overall, it sounds as if he's relatively bullish in terms of what's going to transpire in the rest of this year.
Yeah, he said over the past 3 weeks that they've seen a doubling of their traffic levels, and he expects that to continue, as we go forward. Also, as a result of COVID and more people being interested in flying privately just because of social distancing and health reasons, he said that over the past 4 weeks that the sales inquiries has, quote, gone off the charts. So, that's a good sign. He's very bullish. He said that he sees a lot of upside for the industry, in general, but also for Flexjet.
Okay, that's interesting to hear. I know I'd be flying private if I could, but there we go. Well, thank you for that update, Chad.
All right, thanks, Charlie. So let's hop over to Kerry, who talked to Jens Henning at Gamma this week. And apparently there's a lot of ADS-B installations still going on, but the deadline was January 1st. So how does that work?
Well, Chad, there have been something like over almost 22,000 installs through the first month of the year, actually 21,175. That's the latest data that Jens had. And part of this is that some of the slots to get your aircraft updated or upgraded to ADS-B were all filled throughout last year, and it was getting harder to squeeze them in. So some operators just pushed it into the new year. Others just decided late in the game that they needed to update. Interestingly, of these installs, 33,598 occurred in March, 2,857 in April, and 3,146 in May. Now, these are U.S. installs. Let me clarify that this is FAA data, which shows that during the COVID pandemic, the installs were continuing. So the theory is there may have been some people who were using the downtime in operations to get that work done. Now, I asked about, for those who are late to the game, are they getting violated? What's going on? And there isn't real, even anecdotal evidence that anyone's been grounded because of it or violated. But the FAA in early February, which had issued somewhat of an exemption process, did report that they were getting, in the terms of hundreds versus, 50, 60, 70,000 daily operations of exemptions every day in the hundreds. So that was a good news part, that most of the people who were flying regularly through ADS-B airspace were equipped and have been.
So how long will this go on? What is GAMA saying? How many more airplanes need to be updated, at least on the turbine side?
I asked that, and I don't know that there's a specific number. As far as the business jets go, the ones that were in high utilization, regularly flying through the airspace, were in the upper 90s at the end of the year. And those who were lower utilization were in the lower 90s. So it trickles on the business jet. The real big front are the turboprops, the piston aircraft, which may not regularly fly through, and of course the helicopters. Now, there's not real good hard data on helicopters that I have available at this moment, but they are coming up. So that's where you're going to see it. And where you're also going to see it is internationally, because even though EASA provided a little more time on their deadlines through, it was supposed to be June, now it's the end of the year, and that's kind of a soft deadline, if you will, because you have to have a plan by the end of the year. That's where the installs are coming. And some of the older model aircraft, of course, it's inversely proportioned. If there's, a newer aircraft, chances are you're going to already be equipped or have already equipped, but the older aircraft are the ones that are like in the 10, 20, 30 percentile. So those are the ones that you're going to see get equipped. And, there was some slippage in Mexico too. So operators internationally is where you're going to see a lot of that work happening. Well,
another interesting aspect is that the planned retirement of older business aircraft because of the ADS-B requirement isn't really happening, right?
No, and it's funny, Jens said he never really bought into that whole theory that there was going to be this bow wave of retirements because operators were not going to be willing to make the investment. He said you can look at the book values of some of these aircraft, and sure, they're only in the $500,000 to $1 million range, but that doesn't mean what the value is to the owner. Those aircraft are owned for a specific reason, used for a specific purpose, and their value to the owner is much higher than that. And the alternative would be either to leave business aviation and retire their aircraft because they're not going to be able to sell it, or B, invest a whole lot more money, $5 million, $10 million, into an upgraded aircraft, or, spend a couple $100,000 on upgrading to ADS-B. And that's what most have chosen to do. So there may have been a trickle of retirements, but most have hung on to their aircraft and just made the investment.
Oh, that's really interesting, Kerry. Thank you. So we had some good news this week, Curt, on the FBO front. A bunch of new FBOs opening and more expansion plans. So what are you hearing?
Well, I'm sure, Chad, when these FBOs broke ground on their facilities more than a year ago, they couldn't have foreseen the aviation landscape being what it is today, because nobody could. But you had two new FBO openings announced this week. You had Galaxy FBO, which adds to the flock of service providers at Houston's William P. Hobby Airport. There's now 6 FBOs there. Galaxy had been planning this FBO. They had a significant presence there with their sister company, Wing Aviation, which is one of the state's largest charter operators, and they decided that they wanted to go for their own FBO rather than have to rely on other service providers. So that's been a long-standing project, and they finally opened it. It's a pretty big FBO there now, and adds, as I said, to the flock of service providers there. Another one that was opened was AvFlight at Gerald R. Ford International Airport in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And that's another one that was started almost more than a year ago. And that finally opened this week as well.
And then Galaxy's also expanding. They've announced more expansion plans too, right?
That's correct. Galaxy, which had been existing for a long time with just one FBO at Conroe North Houston Regional Airport, has just doubled its size with the addition at Houston Hobby, and now they announced that they've broken ground at Dallas area Addison Airport as well. So in addition to a small heliport that they operate in the Houston area, that'll give them 3 full-service FBOs.
Oh, that's really good. Anything else going on the FBO front right now?
Well, just it's business as usual. They're all trying to show what measures they're taking to provide the best care and best sanitary services they can, and just trying to wait it out and see when there's going to be an upswing again in business aviation.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Curt. Thanks for listening to AINdebrief. Another podcast episode will air next Friday. In the meantime, go to www.ainonline.com for the latest aviation news from AIN.